Hey there, sleepy historians. Tonight we're diving into the shadowy corners of medieval justice, where punishment was an art form as twisted as it was creative. These weren't the familiar stocks and pillories you might imagine, but rather ingenious devices born from the medieval mind's peculiar blend of creativity and cruelty. If you're finding comfort in these nighttime journeys through history, a gentle like or subscribe would mean the world to me. I'm curious, where in the world are you listening from as you drift off tonight? Drop a comment and let me know what corner of the globe you're calling home. So find that perfect spot where you feel most at peace. ... Let your shoulders drop. Take that slow, deep breath, and let's wander together into the strange world of medieval punishment. Tonight we'll explore 5 bizarre forms of justice that history has largely forgotten, each one revealing something profound about the societies that created them. The Scolds, Bridle, silencing the unruly Tungoyor standing in a cobblestone courtyard in 16th century England, the morning mist clinging to your woolen cloak like ghostly fingers. The air carries the scent of wet stone and wood smoke from nearby chimneys, mixing with the earthy smell of horses and the faint aroma of fresh bread from the baker's shop just beyond the square. Before you stands a woman, her face partially obscured by an intricate iron contraption that encases her head like a cage forged by some medieval artisan's fevered imagination. This is the Scold's bridle, and you can see how the cold metal presses against her temples with unforgiving precision. The device has a flat iron piece that sits heavily on her tongue, preventing speech entirely, while allowing her to breathe through carefully positioned holes. You notice how the metal has been polished smooth in some places from repeated use, while other areas show the rough hammer marks of the blacksmith who crafted this particular instrument of silence. The metalwork is almost beautiful in its cruel precision, wrought iron twisted into decorative patterns that mock the woman's, suffering with their artistic flourishes. Spirals and leaves have been worked into the design, as if the craftsman couldn't resist adding beauty to brutality. You can hear the faint sound of her breathing through the metal, labored and careful, each breath a conscious effort that speaks to the device's effectiveness. Her eyes, visible through the openings, hold a mixture of humiliation and defiance that makes your chest tighten with empathy. Their brown eyes, you notice, flecked with gold that catches the morning light filtering through the mist. There's intelligence there, and perhaps that's what led to her current predicament. Too much wit, too sharp a tongue for a society that preferred its women silent and compliant. This punishment was reserved for women deemed too talkative, too argumentative, or simply too independent for the comfort of their male-dominated communities. The charges could be as simple as gossiping with neighbors, arguing with a husband, or expressing opinions too forcefully in public. You watch as she's led through the town square, the bridle's chain rattling softly with each step, creating a metallic melody that serves as a soundtrack to her shame. The townspeople barely glance up from their morning tasks. This spectacle has become as common as the baker's daily bread, or the church bells marking the hours. A woman sweeping, her doorstep pauses to watch, her own expression unreadable. Is she thinking of her own sharp words, wondering how close she might be to wearing such a device herself? You follow the procession as it moves through the narrow streets, past half-timber-bird houses whose upper stories lean precariously over the cobblestones. The woman's dress is simple but well made. She's not from the poorest class, which makes her punishment all the more pointed. Even women of means could find themselves silenced if they stepped too far beyond society's narrow boundaries. The constable leading her is a middle-aged man with graying hair and weathered hands that speak of years of manual labor before taking on this role. His face shows neither cruelty nor particular compassion. This is simply his job, as routine as any other civic duty. The chain in his hand is worn smooth from use, and you wonder how many women have been led through these same streets, their voices stolen by iron and social convention. As you observe the scene, you notice the subtle reactions of the crowd. Some women look away quickly, as if the sight might be contagious. Others whisper behind their hands to companions, their voices barely audible above the morning sounds of the awakening town. A few men nod approvingly, their expressions suggesting they believe justice is being served. The woman stumbles slightly on an uneven cobblestone, and the bridle shifts against her face. You can see how the metal has already begun to chafe her skin, leaving red marks where the iron presses too firmly. By the end of her punishment, typically lasting from sunrise to sunset, these marks will have deepened into painful welts that will serve as a reminder long after the device is removed. The procession stops at the market cross, a stone monument, at the heart of the town where public announcements are made and punishments displayed. Here she stands for hours while the town goes about its business around her. The irony is palpable, silenced for speaking too much. She now becomes the center of attention, her very presence speaking volumes about the consequences of female independence. You watch as the constable secures her to a post with a short chain, ensuring she cannot wander, but allowing enough movement to prevent the torture from becoming fatal. The medieval mind was precise in its cruelty. Punishment should be memorable and humiliating, but it shouldn't create martyrs or deprive the community of productive members permanently. As the morning progresses, you observe the subtle theater of punishment. Children are brought by their mothers to see the consequences of unruly behavior. Young women glance nervously and hurry past, while older women sometimes pause to shake their heads in disapproval, though whether they disapprove of the woman's original transgression or her current treatment remains unclear. The sun climbs higher, and you can see how the metal of the bridle begins to warm against her skin. What started as cold iron pressing against flesh now becomes a heated reminder of her situation. Sweat begins to bead on her forehead, and you realize that the simple act of perspiring becomes complicated when one's face is caged in metal. A merchant setting up his stall nearby glances at her occasionally, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps he's remembering his own wife's sharp tongue. Or maybe he's calculating whether such public displays are good or bad for business. The medieval marketplace was as much about social theater as commercial exchange, and punishment was simply another form of entertainment. You notice how the woman's posture changes throughout the morning. Initially defiant, shoulders back and head held as high as the bridle allows, she gradually begins to sag under the weight of both the iron device and the accumulated stares of her neighbors. This physical transformation is precisely what the punishment is designed to achieve, the breaking of spirit through sustained humiliation. The drunkard's cloak. Wearing your shame, the scene shifts like a dream dissolving into another, and you find yourself in a German marketplace circa 1600. The autumn air is crisp and clean, carrying the scent of apples and fermenting grain from the nearby brewery, mixed with the earthy smell of fallen leaves and the smoke from countless chimneys. Your attention is drawn to a man stumbling through the crowd, but something is terribly wrong with his silhouette. He appears almost barrel-shaped, his human form distorted into something both comical and tragic. He's wearing what appears to be a wooden barrel, but as you look closer, you realize it's been fashioned into a grotesque garment with the skill of a master carpenter. The barrel has been hollowed out with holes cut for his head and arms, transforming what was once a container for precious ale into an instrument of public shame. You can see how the rough wood chafes against his neck, leaving red marks on his pale skin that speak to hours already spent in this mobile prison. This is the drunkard's cloak, and you watch as the man tries to navigate the marketplace with what little dignity he can muster. The barrel is heavy. You can tell by the way his shoulders sag and how he pauses every few steps to catch his breath, the wood creaking ominously with each movement. The craftsmanship is crude but effective, with iron bands holding the staves together and rough rope threaded through holes to secure it around his torso. Children follow behind him, giggling and pointing with the casual cruelty that only the young can display, while their mothers pull them away with disapproving clicks, bared of their tongues. But you notice that some of the mothers' disapproval seems directed at the children's behavior rather than the man's punishment, suggesting a complexity of social attitudes toward this form of justice. The wood is stained dark with wine and ale, evidence of his crime painted permanently on his punishment like a scarlet letter made of oak and shame. You can smell the sour scent of old alcohol that has soaked into the grain, creating an olfactory reminder of the excess that led to his current predicament. The stains form patterns across the barrel's surface, some fresh and dark, others faded to brown with age, suggesting this particular cloak has seen multiple uses. You notice how he keeps his eyes downcast, the shame radiating from him like heat from a forge. His face, visible above the barrel's rim, is flushed not just from the physical exertion of carrying his wooden burden, but from the emotional weight of public humiliation. The barrel creaks with each movement, a wooden symphony of humiliation that echoes off the stone buildings and announces his presence to anyone within hearing. The marketplace around him continues its daily rhythm, but his presence creates subtle ripples in the normal flow of commerce. Vendors pause in their hawking to watch him pass, some with amusement, others with the kind of uncomfortable recognition that suggests they see their own potential fate in his predicament. A baker, emerging from his shop with fresh loaves, stops to stare, flour still dusting his hands and aprons. You follow the man as he makes his way through the crowd, noting how people react to his approach. Some step aside with exaggerated movements, as if drunkenness might be contagious, while others seem to deliberately block his path, forcing him to navigate around them with awkward, barrel-hindered movements. The social dynamics are complex. This is punishment, but it's also entertainment, and the line between justice and cruelty blurs in the autumn morning light. The man's hands, protruding from the armholes, are calloused and strong. The hands of a craftsman or laborer, not be a habitual drunkard. This detail makes his punishment more poignant, suggesting that his crime was perhaps a single night of excess rather than chronic alcoholism. Medieval justice was often more concerned with public order than individual circumstances, and one bad decision could result in lasting consequences. As you observe more closely, you notice the ingenious cruelty of the device's design. The barrel is sized to be uncomfortable but not impossible to carry, heavy enough to be burdensome but not so heavy as to cause collapse. The armholes are positioned to force an unnatural posture, causing the wearer's shoulders to ache and his back to strain with each step. Every aspect has been calculated to maximize discomfort while maintaining the spectacle of public shame. A group of merchants conducting business near a cloth stall pause, their negotiations to watch the man pass. Their conversation, conducted in low German dialects, includes words you recognize: trinker, drinker, shand, shame, and gerechtigkeit, justice. Their tones suggest a mixture of disapproval and satisfaction, as if the punishment confirms their own moral superiority. The man stops near a fountain in the center of the square, and you can see his desperate desire for water. The irony is cruel, surrounded by the evidence of his overindulgence in alcohol. He now suffers from thirst that he cannot easily satisfy. The barrel's design makes it difficult for him to bend forward to drink, and his hands cannot reach his mouth while his arms are trapped in the wooden sleeves. A woman approaches with a ladle of water, and for a moment you think you're witnessing an act of mercy. But as she gets closer, you see the calculation in her eyes. This is not kindness, but another form of humiliation. She holds the water just out of reach, forcing him to beg, to acknowledge his dependence on the charity of those he has presumably wronged through his drunken behavior. The psychological torture is as carefully crafted as the physical discomfort. The man must navigate not just the physical challenges of wearing the barrel, but the social minefield of a community that has judged him and found him wanting. Every interaction becomes a negotiation of power, with him at the bottom of the hierarchy, dependent on others for the most basic human needs. You notice how the punishment affects not just the wearer, but the entire community. Children learn lessons about behavior and consequences, while adults are reminded of social boundaries and the importance of moderation. The Drunkard's Cloak serves as a mobile morality play, carrying its message through every street and square in the town. As the day progresses, you observe how the man's movements become more labored. The initial adrenaline of shame has worn off, replaced by the grinding reality of physical discomfort and social isolation. His breathing becomes more labored, visible in the cool autumn air, as small puffs of vapor that escape from within his wooden prison. The marketplace begins, too thin, as the morning gives way to midday. But the man's punishment continues. Unlike the woman in the Scold's Bridle, who remains stationary, he must keep moving, carrying his shame through every corner of the community. The barrel has become both his prison and his pillory, mobile and inescapable, ensuring that his humiliation reaches every citizen who might benefit from witnessing the consequences of excess. The pillory of ears, nailed to truth fuel, transported now to a bustling London street in the 1400s, where the very air seems thick with history and human suffering. The atmosphere is heavy with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting vegetables from the nearby market, and the ever-present smoke from countless hearths that creates a hazy canopy over the narrow streets. A crowd has gathered around a wooden structure that looks deceptively simple at first glance, just a weathered post with a horizontal board, standing like a crude scarecrow in the midst of the urban chaos. But as you push through the crowd, past merchants hawking their wares, and beggars pleading for alms, you see the true horror of this particular form of medieval justice. A man's head and hands are locked through holes in the board, his body bent at an uncomfortable angle that speaks to hours of enforced immobility. But something is terribly, viscerally wrong with his ears. They've been nailed to the wooden pillory, pinning his head in place with an intimacy of pain that makes you wince and turn away before forcing yourself to look again. The nails are small but effective, driven through the soft flesh of his earlobes into the weathered wood with the precision of a carpenter who has performed this task many times before. You can see tiny rivulets of dried blood staining the timber dark, creating abstract patterns that speak to the body's desperate attempt to heal around the iron intrusion. His face is a mask of exhaustion and agony, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool morning air that carries the scent of the victims and the promise of rain. This punishment was reserved for those who spread lies or false rumors, and the symbolic justice is as pointed as the nails themselves. The ears that heard and repeated falsehoods now bear the literal weight of his transgression, pinned to the instrument of his punishment like a grotesque trophy. You can see how he tries to hold his head perfectly still, knowing that any movement will tear the delicate flesh and increase his agony exponentially. The crowd around you murmurs and points with the casual cruelty of people who have made entertainment out of another's suffering. Bile some throw rotten fruit that splatters against the wood near his face, close enough to spray him with putrid juice, but carefully aimed to avoid hitting him directly, even in their cruelty. They understand the boundaries that separate justice from murder, You notice how he flinches, not from the impact of the thrown objects, but from the involuntary movement that tugs at his pinned ears, each tiny motion sending waves of pain through his skull. A woman in a stained apron pushes past you, carrying a basket of vegetables that have seen better days. She pauses to examine the man's face with the detached interest of someone studying a particularly interesting specimen, then selects a particularly rotten turnip from her basket. Her throw is accurate, and the vegetable explodes against the pillory just inches from his nose, covering his face with brown, stinking pulp that he cannot wipe away. The irony isn't lost on you. The ears that heard and spread falsehoods now bear the weight of his punishment, while his mouth, which spoke the lies, remains free to cry out in pain. But you notice that he makes very little sound, perhaps understanding that any expression of suffering will only encourage the crowd's cruel entertainment. His silence is more eloquent than screams would be, speaking to a dignity that survives. Even this degradation, you observe the crowd more carefully, noting the social dynamics at play in this theater of punishment. Well-dressed merchants stand alongside common laborers, united in their judgment of the man's transgression. Children are held up by their parents to get a better view, their wide eyes taking in lessons about truth and consequences that will shape their understanding of justice for years to come. A priest moves through the crowd, his brown robes marking him as a member of one of the mendicant orders. He pauses near the pillory, and for a moment you think he might offer comfort or absolution to the suffering man. Instead, he begins to speak in a loud voice about the sins of bearing false witness, using the man's punishment as a text for an impromptu sermon that draws more onlookers to the scene. The wooden pillory itself tells a story of repeated use. The holes for head and hands are worn smooth by countless previous occupants, and the wood around the nail holes shows the stains and scars of multiple punishments. You can see where previous nails have been driven, creating a constellation of small holes that speak to the routine nature of this particular form of justice. As you watch, a constable approaches with a bucket of water and a rough cloth. For a moment, you think this might be an act of mercy, but you quickly realize it's maintenance rather than kindness. He begins to clean the rotten fruit and vegetables from the pillory, not to comfort the prisoner, but to ensure that the spectacle remains visible to the crowd. The man's suffering must be clearly displayed, not obscured by the detritus of public entertainment. The physical details of the punishment become more apparent as you observe longer. The man's hands, locked in the lower holes of the pillory, have begun to swell from the restricted circulation. His fingers are turning a purplish color that speaks to the careful calibration of medieval justice, painful and humiliating, but not immediately life-threatening. The goal is punishment and deterrence, not execution. You notice how the crowd's composition changes throughout the day. Morning brings the merchants and craftsmen on their way to work, who pause briefly to witness the spectacle before continuing about their business. Midday draws the housewives and servants running errands, who often linger longer, perhaps finding in the man's punishment a welcome break from their daily routines. Afternoon brings the children released from their chores, who approach with the fearless curiosity of youth. The man's eyes, when you can see them through his sweat and the accumulated filth thrown by the crowd, hold a particular kind of desperation. It's not just physical pain, though that's clearly intense, but the psychological torture of being reduced to a public spectacle. Every person who stops to stare strips away another layer of his humanity, transforming him from a person into an object lesson about the consequences of dishonesty. A young woman approaches the pillory, her dress and bearing suggesting she's from a merchant family of some standing. She carries herself with confidence, but you notice how she keeps her distance from the crowd, observing from the periphery rather than joining in the cruel entertainment. Her expression is thoughtful rather than gleeful, and you wonder if she's considering the thin line between respectability and ruin that this punishment represents. The afternoon sun climbs higher, and you can see how the man's ordeal intensifies with the heat. What began as cool morning air has given way to the warmth of a London afternoon, and the sun beats down on his exposed head and neck. The metal nails in his ears conduct heat, adding another layer of discomfort to his already overwhelming suffering. Sweat runs down his face, mixing with the stains of thrown food to create a mask of misery that speaks to the thoroughness of medieval justice, the shame. Flute. The musicians burden the cobblestones beneath your feet are slick with morning dew, as you find yourself in a medieval German town square, the Gothic architecture rising around you like stone prayers frozen in time. The Gothic spires of the cathedral pierce the grey sky above, their bells tolling the hour with deep resonant notes that seem to vibrate through your very bones. But your attention is drawn away from the architectural grandeur to a peculiar procession approaching through the narrow streets, creating ripples of curiosity and whispered commentary among the early morning crowd. A musician walks slowly through, the square, but instead of carrying his instrument with the pride typical of his profession, he wears it like a yoke of shame. The flute has been fashioned into a collar of sorts, its wooden body curved around his neck in a grotesque parody of jewelry, transforming the instrument of his livelihood into the symbol of his disgrace. You can see how the instrument's weight pulls at his shoulders, forcing him to walk with a hunched, defeated posture that speaks to both physical discomfort and psychological devastation. This is the shame flute, a punishment specifically designed for musicians who played poorly at inappropriate times, or who violated the strict social codes governing their profession. The irony is exquisite and cruel. The very instrument that was meant to bring joy and beauty into the world now serves as a symbol of his failure, a wooden albatross that announces his incompetence to everyone within sight. You notice how his fingers unconsciously move as if playing, muscle memory betraying his desire to create music even in his humiliation. The ghost of melodies playing out in silent finger movements that no one can hear. The wood of the flute is polished smooth from years of use, its surface bearing the patina that comes only from countless hours of handling and playing. But now it's stained with his sweat and tears, the salt of his shame soaking into the grain and darkening the wood in irregular patterns that map his suffering. Small bells have been attached to the instrument, their bright silver surfaces catching the morning light as they jingle softly with each step he takes. The sound is almost musical, a bitter reminder of what he's lost and a cruel mockery of his former profession. Each step creates a tiny symphony of humiliation, the bells chiming in random patterns that create discord rather than harmony. You watch as he passes, his eyes fixed on the ground, the weight of his shame as heavy as the wooden collar around his neck, perhaps heavier. The crowd's reaction is complex and layered, reflecting the particular social position that musicians occupied in medieval societies. They were necessary for celebrations and religious ceremonies, but they were also viewed with suspicion as potential sources of moral corruption and social disorder. A group of merchants near a cloth stall paused their negotiations to watch him pass, their expressions mixing disapproval with a kind of satisfied vindication, as if his punishment confirms their suspicions about the reliability of artistic types. You notice how other musicians in the crowd react to the spectacle. A young man carrying a lute case quickly looks away and hurries past, as if the sight of his colleague's punishment might somehow contaminate his own reputation. An older woman with a small drum tucked under her arm stops to stare, her face showing a mixture of sympathy and fear. Sympathy for a fellow musician's suffering, fear that she might someday find herself in a similar situation. The shame flute itself is a masterpiece of targeted humiliation. Unlike punishments that could be applied to anyone, this device is specifically crafted for musicians, making their disgrace immediately apparent to anyone who sees them. The wooden collar has been carved with decorative elements that mock the artistry the wearer once claimed to possess. Crude musical notes and instruments carved into the surface with deliberate lack of skill, as if to emphasize the gap between artistic pretension and actual ability. As the musician continues his slow progress through the square, you observe how the punishment affects his entire being. His shoulders, once held back with the pride of a performer, now curve inward under the weight of the wooden collar. His hands, which once moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to creating beauty, now hang limp at his sides, occasionally twitching with a phantom memory of fingering positions on instruments he can no longer play. The psychological torture is as carefully crafted as the physical discomfort. Every person who recognizes him as a musician understands immediately that he has failed at his chosen profession, that his skills have been judged inadequate by the community he sought to serve. The shame flute announces not just punishment, but professional death. Who would hire a musician who has been publicly declared incompetent? A group of children follows behind him, mimicking his hunched posture and making exaggerated movements as if playing invisible instruments. Their laughter is cruel but innocent, the thoughtless cruelty of youth that cuts deeper than adult malice because it comes without understanding of its impact. The musician's face flushes red with each giggle and whispered comment, but he continues walking, understanding that any reaction will only encourage more attention. You notice how the punishment creates ripples throughout the musical community. Other musicians give the square a wide berth, taking alternate routes to avoid being associated with the spectacle. A tavern keeper, who normally employs musicians for evening entertainment, watches from his doorway, perhaps reconsidering his hiring practices or wondering about the quality of his current performers. The wooden collar has been designed with particular attention to the musician's specific transgression. If he played too loudly or at inappropriate times, the bells attached to his shame flute ensure that his every movement creates unwanted sound. If he played poorly, the crude carving on the collar serves as a constant reminder of the gap between his aspirations and his abilities. The punishment is tailored to fit the crime with medieval precision. As you follow the procession, you begin to understand the broader social implications of this particular form of justice. Music in medieval society was not just entertainment, but a crucial component of religious worship, civic celebration, and social cohesion. A musician who failed in his duties didn't just disappoint an audience. He potentially disrupted the dairy fabric of community life. The shame flute serves as a warning to other musicians about the importance of maintaining professional standards. The man's breathing becomes more labored as the morning progresses. The weight of the wooden collar and the stress of public humiliation taking their toll. You can see how he tries to time his steps to minimize the jingling of the bells. But the effort required to walk silently while carrying such a burden only adds to his exhaustion. Every attempt to minimize his shame only serves to highlight a bit further. A priest emerges from the cathedral, drawn by the sound of the bells and the murmur of the crowd. His expression is stern as he approaches the musician, and you realize that the man's transgression may have had religious as well as secular implications. Perhaps he played during a sacred service, or failed to perform adequately during an important religious ceremony. The priest's presence adds another layer of authority to the punishment, suggesting that the musician has offended not just the community, but God himself. The shame flute begins to chafe against the man's neck as the morning wears on, the rough wood rubbing against his skin with each movement. You can see red marks forming where the collar presses most heavily, and you realize that by the end of his punishment, he'll carry physical scars as well as psychological ones. The medieval mind understood that effective punishment should leave lasting reminders of the consequences of transgression. The Branks, Scottish justice in Iron, final stop, takes you to a Scottish village in the 1500s, where the morning mist clings to the heather-covered hills like the breath of sleeping giants. The air is clean and sharp, carrying the scent of peat smoke from cottage hearths and wild roses that grow in profusion along the stone walls that divide the small plots of land. In the village square, surrounded by low stone buildings with thatched roofs, stands a woman whose face is hidden behind an elaborate iron mask that transforms her into something almost otherworldly, like a figure from a dark fairy tale. The Branks, as they're called in this part of Scotland, are more ornate than their English cousins. The Scold's Bridle. This particular device has been crafted with twisted iron that forms almost decorative patterns, like a grotesque piece of jewelry forged by a blacksmith with artistic pretensions and a cruel imagination. But you can see the cruel functionality beneath the artistry, the iron bit that sits heavily on her tongue, the leather straps that dig into her scalp, and the small padlock that ensures she cannot remove the device herself, making her dependent. Pull on her captors for even this basic freedom. What strikes you most profoundly about this scene is the silence. In a world where women's voices were already constrained by social convention and legal restriction, this device removes them entirely, creating a bubble of enforced quiet around its wearer that seems to extend outward into the surrounding space. You watch as she tries to communicate through gestures, her hands moving gracefully despite the iron cage that imprisons her head, creating a kind of desperate ballet of attempted communication. The morning light catches the metal, creating patterns of shadow and brightness across her face that make her seem almost ethereal, like a saint in a stained glass window or a figure from Celtic mythology. The iron has been polished to a dull shine, and you can see your own reflection distorted in its surface, creating an unsettling sense of connection between observer and victim. The craftsmanship is remarkable. Whoever made this device took pride in their work, adding flourishes and decorative elements that speak to hours of careful labor. The punishment will last until sunset, when the magistrate deems her lesson learned and her debt to social order paid. But you sense that the real lesson is for the other women watching from their doorways, understanding with crystalline clarity that their own voices hang by the thinnest of threads, subject to the whims of husbands, fathers, and community leaders who hold the keys to these iron silences. The Branks gleam in the morning light, beautiful and terrible. A reminder that even justice can be a work of art when it serves the purposes of social control. You notice how the woman's eyes move constantly, tracking the movements of people around, her with an intensity that speaks to the heightened awareness that comes with vulnerability. Unable to speak, she must rely entirely on observation and gesture to navigate a world that has suddenly become much more dangerous and unpredictable. Her eyes are green. You notice the color of deep forest pools, and they hold an intelligence that the iron mask cannot diminish. The village around her continues its daily rhythm, but her presence creates subtle alterations in the normal flow of activity. Women hurry past with their eyes downcast, while men pause to stare with expressions that range from satisfaction to discomfort. Children approach with the fearless curiosity of youth, reaching out to touch the iron before being pulled away by nervous parents who would understand the complex social dynamics at play. A young girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, approaches with a cup of water. The gesture seems kind at first, but you quickly realize the cruel impossibility of the situation. The woman cannot drink while wearing the Branks, and the child's offer becomes another form of torture, highlighting her helplessness, pan-dependence. The girl's mother quickly intervenes, pulling her daughter away with sharp words about appropriate behavior. But the damage is done. The iron bit that sits on the woman's tongue is designed with particular cruelty. It's not just a simple bar, but a shaped piece of metal with small spikes or ridges that make any attempt to move her tongue painful. You can see how she holds her mouth carefully, understanding that any attempt to speak or even swallow carelessly will result in pain that she cannot express or seek comfort for. As the morning progresses, you observe how the punishment affects not just the woman, but the entire community. Conversations become more subdued when people pass near her, as if her enforced silence creates a zone of quiet that extends beyond her immediate presence. Women speak in whispers, perhaps unconsciously, afraid that their own voices might somehow attract similar punishment. The village blacksmith emerges from his forge, wiping his hands on a leather apron that bears the stains of his trade. He pauses to examine his handiwork, and you realize with a chill that he's the craftsman who created this particular instrument of torture. His expression shows neither pride nor shame, just the professional satisfaction of work well done, as if the Branks were no different from a horseshoe or a plowshare. You notice how the woman's posture changes throughout the morning. Initially, she stands straight despite her burden, maintaining what dignity she can in the face of public humiliation. But as the hours pass and the weight of the iron mask takes its toll, her shoulders begin to sag and her head droops forward. The physical manifestation of psychological defeat that the punishment is designed to achieve, that the leather straps that secure the Branks to her head have been carefully adjusted to ensure maximum discomfort without causing permanent damage. They're tight enough to prevent removal, but not so tight as to cut off circulation entirely. You can see how they've begun to leave red marks on her skin, and you realize that these marks will serve as reminders of her punishment long after the device is removed. A merchant arrives in the village square, leading a cart pulled by a horse. He stops to water his animal at the village well, and his eyes are drawn to the woman in the Branks. His expression suggests he's seen similar punishments in other villages, and you realize that these devices and their use are part of a broader system of social control that extends far beyond this single community. The woman attempts to seek shade as the sun climbs higher, but the post to which she's chained limits her movement. The iron mask begins to heat up in the sunlight, adding another layer of discomfort to her ordeal. You can see sweat beginning to bead on the exposed parts of her face, and you realize that the simple act of perspiring becomes complicated when one's face is partially encased in metal. A group of village women gathers near the well, ostensibly to draw water, but clearly more interested in observing the punishment. Their conversation, conducted in low voices, includes speculation about the woman's crime and discussion of whether the punishment fits the transgression. Some seem to approve, nodding sagely about the importance of maintaining proper behavior, while others appear uncomfortable with the spectacle, glancing nervously at the iron mask as if imagining be themselves in similar circumstances. The psychological impact of the Branks extends beyond the immediate punishment. Every woman who sees the device understands that her own freedom of speech exists only at the sufferance of male authority, that the wrong word at the wrong time could result in similar treatment. The Branks serve as a constant reminder of the precarious nature of female autonomy in medieval society, an ironclad argument for the importance of silence and submission as the day wears on. You observe how the woman's attempts at communication become more desperate and creative. Unable to speak, she tries to use her eyes, her posture, and her limited hand movements to convey meaning to those around her. But the iron mask creates a barrier that goes beyond the merely physical. It transforms her into something less, than fully human in the eyes of observers, making empathy and understanding more difficult to achieve. The village priest approaches as the afternoon shadows begin to lengthen, his black robes making him appear like a raven among the more colorfully dressed villagers. He carries a small book, perhaps a prayer book or Bible, and begins to read aloud in Latin. The words are incomprehensible to most of the gathered crowd, but their meaning is clear. This is a religious as well as secular punishment, designed to address sins against both community and divine order. You notice how the woman's breathing becomes more labored as the day progresses. The iron bit makes normal breathing difficult, and the stress of public humiliation adds to her respiratory distress. Each breath becomes a conscious effort, and you realize that even this most basic human function has been complicated by her punishment, adding another layer to the comprehensive nature of her suffering. The Branks represent the culmination of medieval thinking about female behavior and social control. They're not just punishment devices, but statements about the proper place of women in society. Iron arguments for the importance of silence and submission. The elaborate craftsmanship speaks to the importance placed on this form of social control. These weren't crude, hastily made devices, but carefully crafted instruments that represented significant investment of time and skill. As the sun begins to set, painting the Scottish hills in shades of gold and purple, you sense that the woman's ordeal is nearing its end. But you also understand that the real impact of her punishment extends far beyond the hours she spent wearing the Branks. Every woman in the village has received a lesson about the consequences of speaking too freely, and every man has been reminded of his authority to silence female voices when they become inconvenient or threatening. The mist begins to rise from the heather-covered hills as evening approaches, and you feel yourself drifting back through time toward the present. The images of these strange and terrible punishments fade like dreams at dawn, but their lessons about human nature, social control, and the evolution of justice remain vivid and troubling. These devices were not aberrations, but logical extensions of medieval thinking about crime, punishment, and social order. As you return to the comfort of the modern world, you carry with you the weight of these historical truths. The Scold's bridle, the Drunkard's cloak, the Pillory of ears, the shame flute, and the Branks all speak to humanity's capacity for both creativity and cruelty. Our ability to transform even justice into art, and art into torture. Sleep well, knowing that justice, however flawed our current systems might be, has evolved far beyond these medieval nightmares of iron and wood and public shame. The cobblestones fade beneath your feet, the mist clears from the Scottish hills, and the sounds of medieval marketplaces give way to the quiet of your own time and place. But the lessons remain, whispered reminders of how far we've come, and how vigilant we must remain to ensure that justice serves humanity rather than the other way around. Rest now, and let these strange tales of medieval punishment fade into the realm of historical curiosity, where they belong.